Hello, the topic for today is Rise of Nationalism in Europe. We are going to see part 1 of this. In this topic of Rise of Nationalism in Europe part 1, we are going to cover the French Revolution and idea of the nation, the making of nationalism in Europe, and the age of revolution from 1830 to 1848. The rise of nationalism in Europe. So how did this idea of nationalism come into the minds of people of Europe? Frédéric Seurat, a French artist in 1948, prepared a series of 4 prints. He visualized his dream of world made up of democratic and social republic. The first print, which is shown in the image here, shows the people of Europe and America, men and women of all ages and social classes, marching in a long train and offering homage to the Statue of Liberty. Artists of the time of French Revolution personified liberty as a female figure. You can see that she bears a torch of enlightenment in one hand and Charter of Rights of Man in the other. In the foreground of the image lie the shattered remains of the symbols of absolutist institutions. So what is absolutist here? A government or system of rule that has no restraints on the power exercised. It refers to a form of monarchical government that has centralized, militarized, and is repressive. In Seurat's utopian vision, people of the world are grouped as distinct nations identified through flags and national costume. What is utopian vision? A vision of society that is so ideal that it is unlikely to actually exist. If you see the image clearly, leading the procession way past the Statue of Liberty are the United States and Switzerland, which by this time were already nation states. France is identifiable by revolutionary tricolor and has just reached the statue. She is followed by people of Germany bearing the black, red, and gold flag. Interestingly, at that time when Seurat created this image, German people did not even exist as a united nation. The flag which they carry is an expression of liberal hopes into a nation state under a democratic constitution. Following the German people are people of Austria, Kingdom of Two Sicilies, Lombardy, Poland, England, Ireland, Hungary, and Russia. So artist here symbolizes fraternity among nations of the world, and you can also see Christ, saints, and angels gaze upon this scene. Nationalism has emerged as a force which brought about sweeping changes in political and mental world of Europe during 19th century. The end result of these changes was the emergence of nation-state in place of multinational dynastic empires of Europe. So the concept and practices of a modern state in which a centralized power exercised sovereign control over a clearly defined territory had been developing over a long period of time in Europe. A nation state was one in which the majority of its citizens, that is, not only its rulers, came to develop a sense of common identity and shared history or descent. This commonness did not exist from the time immemorial. It was forged through struggles, through the actions of leaders and the common people. So here we'll see the diverse processes through which nation states and nationalism came into being in 19th century Europe. The French Revolution and the idea of the nation. So the first clear expression of nationalism came with the French Revolution in 1789. Until then, it was a full-fledged territorial state under the rule of an absolute monarch. So what changes did the revolution bring about in the nation? They had a series of political and constitutional changes, like transfer of sovereignty from the monarchy to the body of French citizens. The revolution also proclaimed that it was the people who would constitute the nation and shape its destiny rather than the monarch. From the very beginning, the French revolutionaries introduced various measures and practices that could create a sense of collective identity amongst the French people. Ideas of la patrie, which means the fatherland, and les citoyens, that is the citizen, emphasize the notion of a united community enjoying equal rights under a constitution. A new French flag, the tricolor, was chosen to replace the formal royal standard. The Estates General was elected by body of active citizens and renamed as the National Assembly. New hymns were composed, oaths were taken, and martyrs were commemorated, all in the name of the nation. With these kind of ideas, a new centralized administrative system was put in place and has formulated uniform laws for all the citizens within its territory. Internal customs, duties, and dues were abolished, and a uniform system of weights and measures was adopted. Regional dialects were discouraged, and French was spoken and written in Paris became the common language of the nation. The revolutionaries declared that it was the mission and destiny of French nation to liberate the people of Europe from despotism, that is, to help other people of Europe to become nations. When the news of the events in France reached the different cities of Europe, students and other members of educated middle classes began setting up Jacobin clubs. Their activities and campaigns prepared the way for the French armies, which moved into Holland, Belgium, Switzerland, and much of Italy in the 1790s. With the outbreak of revolutionary wars, French armies began to carry the ideas of nationalism abroad. Napoleon, a French military and political leader who rose to prominence during the French Revolution, led several successful campaigns during revolutionary wars. He started introducing many of the reforms that he had already introduced in France in the territories that came under his control. Through a return to monarchy, Napoleon had no doubt destroyed democracy in France, but in the administrative field, he had incorporated revolutionary principles in order to make the whole system more rational and efficient. The Civil Code of 1804 usually known as Napoleonic Code, did away with all privileges based on the birth. It established equality before the law and secured the right to property. This code was exported to the regions under French control. In the Dutch Republic, Switzerland, Italy, and Germany, Napoleon simplified administrative divisions, abolished the feudal system, and freed peasants from serfdom and manorial dues. In the towns, too, guild restrictions were removed. Transport and communication systems were improved. Peasants, artisans, workers, and new businessmen enjoyed a newfound freedom. Businessmen and small scale producers of goods, in particular, began to realize that uniform laws, standardized weights and measures, and a common national currency would facilitate the movement and exchange of goods and capital from one region to another. However, in areas conquered, the reactions of the local population to the French rule were mixed. In many places, such as Holland, Switzerland, as well as in certain cities like Brussels, Mainz, Milan, and Warsaw, the French armies were welcomed as harbingers of liberty. But the initial enthusiasm soon turned to hostility, as it became clear that the new administrative arrangements did not go hand in hand with political freedom of the people. Increased taxation, censorship, forced conscription into French armies required to conquer the rest of the Europe all seem to outweigh the advantages of the administration changes that came into force. The making of nationalism in Europe. In the previous subtopic, we have seen the map of mid-18th century where we don't find any nation states as such. Like the countries Germany, Italy, and Switzerland are divided into kingdoms rather than countries, and rulers had their autonomous territories. Eastern and Central Europe was under autocratic monarchies within the territories of which lived diverse people. Often they spoke different languages and belonged to different ethnic groups. And they did not have a collective identity or a common culture. For example, Habsburg Empire is a patchwork of many different regions and people. In Hungary, half of the population spoke Magyar while other half spoke a variety of dialects. The aristocracy spoke Polish in Galicia. Besides these three dominant groups, they also lived within the boundaries of the empire a mass of subject peasant people. Bohemians and Slovaks to the north, Slovenes in the Carignolia, Croats to the south, and the Romans to the east in Transylvania. Such differences did not easily promote a sense of political unity. So only binding thing between these diverse groups was a common allegiance to the emperor. So how did nationalism and idea of nation state emerge from these different kinds of diverse groups? Let's see that. The aristocracy and the new middle class. What is aristocracy? It is a dominant class in Europe where people of higher social class who often had special privileges and were a minority. Socially and politically, a landed aristocracy was the dominant in the continent. They spoke French and they owned estates in the countryside and also townhouses. This powerful aristocracy was, however, a small group, and majority of population was made up of peasantry. To the west, the bulk of land was farmed by tenants and small owners while in Eastern and Central Europe the pattern of landholding was characterized by vast estates which were cultivated by the serfs. In the Western and parts of Central Europe, the growth of industrial production and trade meant the growth of towns and emergence of commercial classes whose existence was based on production for the market. So industrialization began in England in the second half of 18th century. But in France and parts of German states, it occurred only during 19th century. The new social groups came into being. A working class population and middle class made up of industrialists, businessmen, professionals came up. In Central and Eastern Europe, these groups were smaller in number till late 19th century. It was among the educated liberal middle classes that ideas of national unity following the abolition of aristocratic privileges gained popularity. What did liberal nationalism stand for? In early 19th century in Europe, ideas of national unity were closely allied to the ideology of liberalism. The term liberalism is derived from the Latin root liber, which means free. For the new middle classes, liberalism stood for freedom for the individual and equality of all before the law. Let's see how it has politically influenced nationalism. It emphasized concept of government by consent. During French Revolution, liberalism had stood for the end of autocracy and clerical privileges, a constitution and a representative government through parliament. Liberals also stressed the inviolability of private property. That is, it cannot be trespassed or taken away or violated by anyone. However, equality before law did not necessarily stand for universal suffrage, which means right to vote. In revolutionary France, which marked first political experiment in liberal democracy, the right to vote and to get elected was granted exclusively to property owning men. Men without property and all women were excluded from political rights. Only for a brief period under the Jacobins did all adult males enjoy suffrage. So, who are these Jacobins? It is a society formed for influencing political decisions during French Revolution. However, the Napoleonic Code went back to limited suffrage and reduced women to the status of a minor, subject to the authority of fathers and husbands. Throughout the 19th century and early 20th centuries, women and non-propertied men organized opposition movements demanding equal political rights. So let's see how liberalism has impacted economically. It has stood for the freedom of markets and abolition of state-imposed restrictions on the movement of goods and capital. During the 19th century, there was a strong demand of emerging middle classes. For example, the German-speaking regions in the first half of 19th century. Napoleon administrative measures had created out countless small principalities, a confederation of 39 states. Each of these possessed its own currency and weights and measures. A merchant traveling from Hamburg to Nuremberg to sell his goods have to pass through 11 customs barriers and pay a customs duty of about 5% at each one of them. Duties were often levied according to the weights or measurements of the goods. Every region has its own system of weights and measures, and this involved time-consuming calculation. The measure of cloth, for example, was L, which in each region stood for different lengths. Such conditions were viewed as obstacles to economic exchange and growth by new commercial classes. So they argued for creation of a unified economic territory, allowing the unhindered movement of goods, people, and capital. So in 1934, a customs union, also called as the Zollverein, was formed at the initiative of Prussia and joined by most of the German states. The union abolished tariff barriers and reduced the number of currencies from over 30 to 2. The creation of network of railways further stimulated mobility, harnessing economic interest to the national unification. So a wave of economic nationalism strengthened the wider nationalist sentiments growing at the time. A new conservatism after 1815. So what is conservatism? It's a political philosophy that stressed the importance of tradition, established institutions and customs, and it preferred gradual development rather than a quick change. So after the defeat of Napoleon in 1815, European governments were driven by spirit of conservatism. These conservatives believed that established traditional institutions of state and society like the monarchy, church, social hierarchies, property and family should be preserved. However, most of the conservatives did not propose a return to the society of pre-revolutionary days because they realized the changes initiated by Napoleon, that modernization could in fact strengthen traditional institutions like the monarchy. It could make state power more effective and strong. So they thought a modern army, an efficient bureaucracy, a dynamic economy, and abolition of feudalism and serfdom could strengthen the autocratic monarchies of Europe. In 1815, Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Austria had collectively defeated Napoleon. Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Austria are representatives of European power. They all met at Vienna to draw up a settlement for Europe. The Congress was hosted by Austrian Chancellor Duke Metternich. The delegates drew up the Treaty of Vienna of 1815 with the object of undoing most of the changes that had come about in Europe during Napoleonic Wars. The Bourbon dynasty, which had been deposed during French Revolution, was restored to power, and France lost the territories it had annexed under Napoleon. A series of states were set up on the boundaries of France to prevent French expansion in future. Kingdom of Netherlands, which included Belgium, was set up in the north and Genoa was added to Piedmont in the south. Prussia was given important new territories on its western frontiers, while Austria was given control of northern Italy. But the German Confederation of 39 states that had been set up by Napoleon was left untouched. In the east, Russia was given part of Poland while Prussia was given a portion of Saxony. The main intention was to restore the monarchies that had been overthrown by Napoleon and create a new conservative order in Europe. The conservative regimes set up in 1815 were autocratic. They did not tolerate criticism and dissent and sought to curb activities that questioned the legitimacy of autocratic governments. Most of them imposed censorship laws to control what was said in newspapers, books, plays, and songs, and reflected the ideas of liberty and freedom associated with French Revolution. The memory of French Revolution nonetheless continued to inspire liberals. One of the major issues taken up by the liberal nationalists who criticized the new conservative order was freedom of the press. The revolutionaries, fear of repression. After 1815, the fear of repression drove many liberal nationalists underground. Many secret societies sprang up in European states so that they can train revolutionaries and spread their ideas. And to be revolutionary at this time meant a commitment to oppose the monarchical forms that had been established after the Vienna Congress, and also to fight for liberty and freedom. Most of these revolutionaries also saw the creation of nation states as a necessary part of the struggle for freedom. Giuseppe Mazzini. One such individual who was an Italian revolutionary is Giuseppe Mazzini. He was born in Genoa in 1807 and became a member of secret society of Carbonari. He was sent into exile at a young age of 24 for attempting a revolution in Liguria. He subsequently founded two more underground societies, first Young Italy in Marseilles and Young Europe in Bern, whose members were like-minded young men from Poland, France, Italy, and German states. So Mazzini believed that nations to be natural units of mankind. So Italy could not continue to be patchwork of different small states and kingdoms. It had to be forged into a single unified republic within a wider alliance of the nations. This unification alone could be the basis of Italian liberty. Secret societies. Following the model of Giuseppe Mazzini, many secret societies were set up in Germany, France, Switzerland, and Poland. Mazzini's relentless opposition to monarchy and his vision of democratic republics frightened the conservatives. Metternich described him as the most dangerous enemy of our social order. The Age of Revolutions, 1830 to 1848. As conservative regimes try to consolidate their power, liberalism and nationalism came to be increasingly associated with revolution in many regions of Europe, like the Italian and German states, the provinces of the Ottoman Empire, Ireland, and Poland. These revolutions were led by liberal nationalists belonging to the educated middle class elite. Among them were professors, school teachers, clerks, and members of the commercial middle class. The first upheaval took place in France in July 1830. The Bourbon kings, who had been restored power to during the conservative reaction after 1815 were overthrown by liberal revolutionaries who installed a constitutional monarchy with Louis Philippe as his head. The July Revolution sparked an uprising in Brussels which led to Belgium breaking away from United Kingdom of the Netherlands. An event that mobilized nationalist feelings among the educated elite across Europe was the Greek War of Independence. Greece had been part of Ottoman Empire since the 15th century. The growth of revolutionary nationalism in Europe sparked off a struggle for independence amongst the Greeks which began in 1821. Nationalists in Greece got support from other Greeks living in exile and also from many West Europeans who had sympathies for ancient Greek culture. Poets and artists lauded Greece as a cradle of European civilization and mobilized public opinion to support its struggle against a Muslim empire. The English poet Lord Byron organized funds and later went to fight in the war where he died of fever in 1824. Finally, the Treaty of Constantinople of 1832 recognized Greece as an independent nation. The Romantic imagination and national feeling. Feelings of nationalism did not come only through wars and territorial expansion, but also through culture. How did culture play a role here? It created an idea of nation through art and poetry, stories and music, which helped people express and shape nationalist feelings. Romanticism was a cultural movement which aimed for a particular form of national sentiment. Romantic artists and poets generally criticized the glorification of reason and science. Instead, they focused on emotions, intuition, and mystical feelings of people. Their effort was to create a sense of shared collective heritage, a common cultural past, as the basis of a nation. Johann Gottfried Herder, German philosopher, claimed that true German culture can be discovered among the common people, which is Das Volk, a German word for common people. It was through folk songs, folk poetry, and folk dances that the true spirit of nation, Volksgeist, was popularized. Volksgeist is a German word which indicates a spirit of nation. So collecting and recording these forms of folk culture was essential to the project of nation building. They laid emphasis on vernacular language and collection of local folklore, not just to recover an ancient national spirit, but also to carry the modern nationalist message to large audiences who were mostly illiterate. Especially in case of Poland, which was partitioned at the end of 18th century by great powers Russia, Prussia, and Austria. Even though Poland no longer existed as an independent territory, national feelings were kept alive through music and language. Karol Kurpensky celebrated the national struggle through his operas and music, turning folk dances like the Polonaise and Mazurka into nationalist symbols. Language also played an important role in developing nationalist sentiments. After Russian occupation, the Polish language was forced out of schools and Russian language was imposed everywhere. In 1931, an armed rebellion against Russian rule took place, which was ultimately crushed. Following this, many members of the clergy in Poland began to use language as a weapon of national resistance. Polish was used for church gatherings and all religious instructions. As a result, a large number of priests and bishops were put in jail or sent to Siberia by Russian authorities as punishment for their refusal to preach in Russia. Use of Polish came to be seen as a symbol of struggle against Russian dominance. Hunger, hardship, and popular revolt. Let's see how hunger hardship has resulted in a revolt. The 1830s were years of great economic hardship in Europe. The first half of 19th century saw an enormous increase in the population all over Europe. In most countries, there were more seekers of job than employment. Population from rural areas migrated to the cities to live in overcrowded slums. Small producers in towns were often faced with stiff competition from imports of cheap machine-made goods from England, where industrialization was more advanced than on the continent. This was especially so in case of textile production, which was carried out mainly in homes or small workshops and was only partly mechanized. In those regions of Europe where the aristocracy still enjoyed power, peasants struggled under the burden of feudal dues and obligations. The rise of food prices or a year of bad harvest led to widespread pauperism in town and country. Popular revolt. We've already seen that hunger and hardship has started in 1830s in Europe. So this resulted in a revolt in 1848. Food shortages and widespread unemployment brought the population of Paris out on the roads. Barricades were erected and Louis Philippe was forced to flee. A national assembly proclaimed a republic, granted suffrage to all adult males above 21, and guaranteed the right to work. National workshops to provide employment were set up. Earlier in 1845, weavers in Silesia had led a revolt against contractors who supplied them raw materials and gave them orders for finished textiles, but drastically reduced their payments. One of the journalists, Wilhelm Wolff, described the events in a Silesian village with 18,000 inhabitants. Cotton weaving is the most widespread occupation there. The misery of the workers is extreme. The desperate need for jobs has been taken advantage of by the contractors to reduce the prices of goods they order. So on 4th June at 2 p.m., a large crowd of weavers marched in pairs up to the mansion of their contractor, demanding higher wages, who were treated with scorn and threats alternatively. As a result, a group of them forced their way into house, smashed elegant window panes, furniture, porcelain, while another group broke into the storehouse and plundered it of supplies of cloth which they tore to shreds. Subsequently, the contractor fled with his family to a neighboring village. However, he was refused a shelter in that village. Contractor returned 24 hours later, having requisitioned the army. In the exchange that followed, 11 weavers were shot. The Revolution of the Liberals. Parallel to the revolts of the poor, unemployed, and starving peasants and workers in many European countries, in the year 1848, a revolution led by educated middle classes was underway. Events of February 1848 in France had brought about the abdication of monarch, and a republic based on universal male suffrage had been proclaimed. In other parts of Europe where independent nation states did not yet exist, like Germany, Italy, Poland, Austro-Hungarian Empire, men and women of liberal middle classes combined their demands for constitutionalism with national unification. They took advantage of the growing popular unrest to push their demands for the creation of nation state on parliamentary principles like a constitution, freedom of the press, and freedom of association. In the German regions, a large number of political associations whose members were middle class professionals, businessmen, and prosperous artisans came together in the city of Frankfurt and decided to vote for an all-German National Assembly. On 18th May 1848, 831 elected representatives marched in a festive procession to take their places in the Frankfurt Parliament conveyed in the Church of St. Paul. They drafted a constitution for a German nation to be headed by a monarchy subject to a parliament. When the deputies offered the crown on these terms to Frederick Wilhelm IV, King of Prussia, he rejected it and joined other monarchs to oppose. The opposition of the aristocracy and military became stronger. The social basis of parliament eroded. The parliament was dominated by the middle classes who resisted the demands of workers and artisans and consequently lost their support. In the end, troops were called in and assembly was forced to disband. The issue of extending political rights to women was a controversial one within the liberal movement, in which large numbers of women had participated actively over the years. Women had formed their own political associations, founded newspapers, and taken part in political meetings and demonstrations. Despite this, they were denied suffrage rights during election of assembly. When the Frankfurt Parliament convened the Church of St. Paul, women were admitted only as observers to stand in the visitors' gallery. Though conservative forces were able to suppress liberal movements in 1848, they could not restore the old order. Monarchs were beginning to realize that the cycles of revolution and repression could only be ended by granting concessions to the liberal and nationalist revolutionaries. Hence, in the years after 1848, the autocratic monarchies of Central and Eastern Europe began to introduce the changes that had already taken place in Western Europe before 1815. Thus, serfdom and bonded labor were abolished both in Habsburg dominions and in Russia. The Habsburg rulers granted more autonomy to the Hungarians in 1867.